Ghislaine was, she seemed really excited that I was there. He was inside and she handed me the massage bottle and she said, "Off you go, have a good time." I couldn't believe that she knew and that she would still have me go in there.
Where were you born, Anouska, and what was your life like growing up?
So I was born in Ascot and in Surrey, and I suppose when I was little, you know, I had a relatively normal childhood. Later on, my parents did have quite a lot of problems and ended up breaking up. So I think there was some instability there, and what went with that was a lot of moving around, a lot of different schools, a lot of different homes, and we did actually move to the south of France when I was about 10. So, and I loved the south of France, and that really was part of, I think, me stepping into really who I was and my own identity, and that was really good for me. And it was just my mother and I who were there. So we had dogs and we had a good life there. But there was that instability of coming from a broken home that I think is relevant to my story. And when I came back to England at age 16, I didn't know anybody in London. And of course, at 16, I was at an age where I was really I was developing, you know, from a child into a woman, and I was looking for who my peer group would be, where I would fit. I think I felt vulnerable. I felt as though I wanted to present well to my new friend group, and I wanted to be accepted, and maybe would try and appear confident, but I wasn't very confident.
And can you tell me about how you came to meet Ghislaine Maxwell?
Yes, so obviously the first time I met Ghislaine Maxwell is sort of etched into my memory, and I met her through a mutual friend, and I was on a trip to Paris, and I was going out for the evening with a group of people. She met us, I think, in the hotel lobby, and she was a friend of this friend of mine. So for me, that was sort of a qualification of being somebody who was, in a group of trustworthy people, I suppose. It was not a long meeting, and she was kind of amazing. You know, to a 16-year-old, she was very powerful and captivating and intriguing. And the most shocking thing for me is how excited she was to meet me, because I was struggling with my own confidence, and I couldn't imagine that anybody of her standing would be that excited to meet me. So that made me feel both special and also slightly uneasy, because I felt like there was some kind of expectation to be met. So she gave me her phone number, and we exchanged a few words, and she said, "We must meet, you must come over for tea." And we discovered that we lived very close to each other. So my mother's house where I lived was just about a mile from her house.
Did you have an idea of who she was and where she sort of lay in terms of the social environment that you were in?
Well, I knew who her father was. That was pretty common knowledge in London and in the circles that I was mixing in. And I knew that he had been a very powerful and also quite a foreboding person. So I knew sort of where she came from. And then really it was more about who she was as a character. Her charisma was infectious, and it was something that I felt really, I wanted to be part of her, whatever was going on with her, because she just seemed to be exciting.
What was the progression of the relationship that you had with Ghislaine, and how did she leverage the similarities that you shared?
It's funny because at the time, I had no idea that anything was being leveraged. I thought I was meeting a new person as I had met thousands of new people. And this would be a situation where perhaps we might become, more friendly, or something might develop as some kind of a relationship, maybe as some kind of a mentor. She would point out the similarities and say, "Oh, you speak French, I speak French too." And "Oh, you have a place at Oxford, that's so interesting. I went to Oxford." And so these similarities were pointed out as if they were just coincidences and something that she was finding compelling. And I think one of the key things that she said to me was, I went to Oxford, you're going to Oxford, that's great, we have that, we have this in common, but what do you really want to do? Because do you really want to become like a solicitor or a lawyer? And this was kind of one of my big secrets, because my family wanted me to go to Oxford, read law, and then become a solicitor and work with my family. And I didn't want to do that at all. I was doing that to please them. But what I really wanted to do was sing and write songs. And she said, "Well, that's amazing. Like, let's make that happen." And then, she didn't elaborate immediately. And I think this is part of what it's important to understand is there's a progression. There's an initiation, and there's a progression of grooming where it's like the boiling of a frog. If you put the frog in cold water and heat it up slowly, it doesn't know it's being boiled. But if you throw a frog in hot water, it jumps out. So I think that grooming process is like being slowly cooked. And, initially it was just, she really likes me, and you're so great, and so interested, and tell me about this, and tell me about that, and tell me about you, and that's amazing. And then it's, I have an amazing boyfriend, and he's like a philanthropist, and he just likes to help people. And, maybe you'll get to meet him. And so it's sort of that carrot that was laid out for me. And then I wanted to meet him, but I didn't say anything. And then it was a phone call, and she said, "He's here. Come now." So I got ready. I wore my mother's clothes, and my mother's quite a lot. I'm quite small. I'm 5'4", and quite petite, and my mother's sort of 5'8". So I was wearing her clothes, and the shoulders were too big, but I wanted to wear grown-up clothes. I didn't want to wear my sort of more childish clothes. And I excitedly and nervously went over there. And I think that initial meeting, hindsight's 2020, and I remember Ghislaine opened the door, and in her living room in London, the front door opened sort of into the living room, and he was sitting in an armchair in like sweatpants, and he was on the phone talking very loudly, and everything from the get-go was sort of instructive, and I could see that there was this weight in the air of like, do this right, don't upset him. And so she's like, "Shh, come in, And she went and sat down. There were 2 armchairs. And I was just standing in front of the front door, sort of in my, interview outfit. And he was on the phone, and he was talking, and he would talk. He was very brash and quite crude and loud. And it was quite intimidating. So I stood there, and after a couple of minutes, he was still on the phone, and I had not been invited to come in further. I had not been invited to sit down. And so I was shifting from one foot to the other, kind of not even knowing where to look, and feeling quite small I suppose. And then he got off the phone and he said, is this her? You know, to Ghislaine. And she's like, yes. This is the one you told me about? Oh, great. And then, you know, he sort of motioned to me to step forward. Still wasn't invited to sit down. And so then he rattles off, like, Ghislaine tells me that you're going to Oxford. Ghislaine tells me, you know, and says all these different things that Ghislaine had told him about me. And then she adds in, you know, what she really wants to do. And I was kind of like, you know, yes, tell him that. And she said, yeah, she wants to be a singer and a songwriter. And then he sort of motioned to her and whispered something in her ear. And she's like, yeah, that's a good idea. I bet they'd like her. And I'm thinking, oh my God, is this a music producer or something? And so I'm kind of like, you know. And then she said, she's also really, really strong. She's strangely strong for someone so small and so young. And she had talked about that I was at school, and which school I was at. And she said, oh, show him how strong you are. And he had just socks on. And she said, go over and just give his feet a little squeeze. And I was kind of like, this is odd. But, I mean, these people were almost my parents' age. And I didn't feel like it was so odd that I could turn it down. So I did it. And I remember this feeling of kind of like my shoulders caving in, of like, I don't like this. But at the same time, it's not, you know, it's not something so crazy. So anyway, the phone rang again. He answered the phone. And then she said, she was just like, okay, go, you know, and just sort of shooed me out of the door. And I remember standing outside and, you know, I had to walk to the end of the road to get a taxi and just kind of feeling like, oh, it was like being in a whirlwind. I'd just been sort of spun around and I had no idea kind of what had happened. And I went back home and my mother said, you know, how did it go? How was the interview? And I said, I think good. I think, you know, I don't know. I did not mention to my mother about this thing because I thought it was strange. And I didn't want her to tell me, you know, I didn't want her to interfere or anything. So that was my first introduction.
And then when did you hear from Ghislaine or Epstein again?
It was on that same trip, I think, the same trip of him being in England, because he would come over to London periodically. She said, listen, I'm in a bit of a pickle, and it's just kind of an emergency because, you know, the massage therapist is cancelled. And, you know, I was just thinking because, you know, you've got such strong hands and I know this isn't like your job or anything, but it would really be like a big favor to me if you could just fill in just for today, you know, because I don't know what to do. And it would be like a favor to me if you could just come. And I was like, okay, like when? And she's like, well, now. I didn't know what I was doing at all, but I wasn't given like a chance to think about it either. And so I went over there and I was like, oh, okay. But I sort of felt like, well, I can do it, you know? I mean, all 16-year-olds think they're more grown up than they are, you know? And so I was trying to make a good impression. Ghislaine was, she seemed really excited that I was there. And she's like, oh my God, you know, you're really saving me. And so she said, follow me. And she walked up the stairs. And I remember looking at the carpet on the stairs as I walked up. And she had a bottle of oil in her hand. And she walked up the stairs and she opened the door. And, you know, he was inside. And she handed me the massage bottle and she said, off you go, have a good time. And on the first interaction, it was far more mild and a lot of questions from Epstein a lot of questions about me and what I like. And, you know, there would be things thrown in about like, oh, you know, have you ever had sex? And what do you like? And I didn't know how, I was so embarrassed. And I had never spoken about these things out loud, even to my girlfriends. The first time was uncomfortable. But again, these are they are micro transgressions. So they're crossing my boundaries in ways that are not so dramatic that I feel like I have to run to the police. And also not so dramatic that I think I need to make a fuss. I think the implication was always there that if you say no, this opportunity is over. And, you know, I didn't need money. That wasn't something that myself or my family were lacking at the time. But I wanted to be included in Ghislaine's group. I wasn't sure if she knew the first time that there was anything sexual happening. And then the second time, he was fully naked when I walked in and when she was standing in the door. So I was like, I think I was shocked then. I was also very ashamed. I felt as though something had been done to me that I would never want anyone else to know about. And I realized that, you know, Ghislaine knew because she would be then talking about how Jeffrey needs a lot of sex, a lot of massages and a lot of sex. And so then I was starting to realize that these two things were maybe part of the same thing. And then, you know, she would say, "Did you have a good time?" And I just didn't know what to say, because at this point I knew that she knew. And I couldn't believe that she knew and that she would still have me go in there. And I was quite scared that my mother would find out. I was quite scared that my peer group, that Ghislaine knew many of these people, that they would find out. And I was confused. I was really, really confused. You know, I felt like I had agreed to something that I didn't know I'd agreed to until after it had happened. And because I didn't know what I was agreeing to. And so the more I became embroiled with the two of them, and the more that Jeffrey abused me and Ghislaine either collaborated or initiated those abuses, the more pleased she seemed, and the more she seemed to want to include me. And I mean, looking back, you know, obviously I want to go back to my younger self and I want to pull myself out of there. And I want to say, you don't have to do this. You can tell people. But the truth is, you know, that was not a time, this was a long time before the Me Too movement. This was in the 90s. And probably lots of people would not have listened to me. I would see Ghislaine more often than I would see Jeffrey. And I see that that was sort of like a maintenance of meeting up with me to make sure that I would be available and to make sure that I was still on the hook, if you will. And, you know, I loved spending time with Ghislaine. I felt so special. I felt so important. And I felt talented and seen and heard. And I felt as though she was the sister I had always wanted. And there was also this sense of deference from Ghislaine to Jeffrey. So she was always modeling that. And she would stare at him. I mean, like, she was obsessed with him. And anything he wanted, it was sort of immediately provided. And so I was kind of like, okay, this is what we have to do. This is what we do. And if even she's doing that, and she's so, you know, she's on such a high level, and she's doing that, this must be what is required. So I was invited to go to Palm Beach. For me, it was a holiday. And they said, you know, Ghislaine said, I want you to come. And I was like, okay. And still the dangling of the different kind of like, there might be a music producer who might come. So it would be great if you were there, and it could be sort of casual, the way you meet, but obviously they're going to be impressed with you. And I went off on this trip, and, you know, my flights were booked. The taxi was booked. This was not a time when we had cell phones. In the 90s, as a 16-year-old, 17, 18-year-old, I didn't have a phone. I certainly didn't have a phone that worked in another country. And so when I got there, I didn't really know where I was. I didn't have the ability to call anybody. I didn't even know how to call out of America to get to another country. And when I got there, the first day I was jet lagged and I was exhausted, and I got shown to my room, and I, you know, had something to eat, and then I went back up to the room, and there was an outfit on my bed, and it was a schoolgirl outfit. And so I went downstairs, and I knew exactly why it was there and what it was for. But I thought the best thing to do was pretend I had no idea why it was there or what it was for, so that maybe it would go away. And I said, Ghislaine, I think someone's left their clothes in my room, you know. And she said, oh, no, it's, I thought it'd be fun for you to take Jeffrey his tea in that. And I was panicking. And she said, what's the matter? Don't you like to play dressing up? And I didn't say anything. I sort of laughed. And she said, go on, off you go, pop it on, and I'll give you the tray. And I was so frightened. I didn't know where I was. I didn't have anyone to call. And I was so frightened. And during that trip, and after that particular event, where I did what she asked me to do, and then was brutally raped by Epstein. I dissociated. And this became a tool for me to be able to escape. And I'm grateful for that tool, you know, because it helped me to be there but not be there. And so I continued to dissociate in an involuntary way throughout these experiences. I also had started to drink alcoholically, and I was struggling. I had been offered a place at Oxford University to study law, and I was not able to go. In fact, I really stopped going to school and started just spiraling. And after that trip to Palm Beach, I had very little self-esteem left. And so I think I was just left feeling worthless. And in fact, my understanding is that Ghislaine has described the girls that she abused as worthless, and that's how she saw us. And so it went on for a long time. And far more with Ghislaine for me than with Jeffrey, but I felt attached to her. And especially because she was attached to a big part of my community still. So I remained in contact. And there were moments when I would reach out, you know? I would reach out as sort of a touch point of, can you validate me still? Because in a strange way, it's like I'd already sacrificed all this. I'd already been through really unimaginable abuse. So I wanted to keep checking that, because I thought nobody else would love me and nobody else would want me because of what had happened. So I think, there's a lot of misunderstanding about that.
It's all part of the cycle of abuse, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And, the best way to keep somebody imprisoned is to imprison them in their own mind, because nobody can see they're in prison. So if you can put in place enough restrictions on somebody that you don't need to put them in a cage, you don't need to put them in chains, they'll never run away and no one will ever know that they want to. Between 26 and 27, I actually stopped drinking, stopped taking any substances, with the help of a 12-step program. And I started to emerge. I started to slightly come back into my own body, into my own identity. Even though I had plans to never tell anybody about this, and even though I had shared it with one person, but I felt confident that she would never share it, I would follow what was going on. So I would Google both Jeffrey and Ghislaine's names. And, I had a daughter in 2013, and I will say there was this, and many of the survivors who I know who've had daughters describe the same experience or a similar experience, where suddenly I looked at her and I saw who I was. I saw this innocence. I saw how precious and fragile this baby girl was. And I saw that I was that too. And I had this realization of what had happened to me and how hard I would fight so that that would never happen to my daughter. And something like a switch flipped for me. So I discovered that Virginia Giuffre, whose name I had never heard before, had filed a civil lawsuit against Ghislaine Maxwell. When I realized it had happened to her, I found it totally unacceptable that it had happened to somebody else. You know, I had somehow reconciled that I could deal with it, I was strong enough, I could sort of deny it and push it down. But the fact that it had happened to someone else, I was furious. And I felt this maternal kind of rage, not only in connection with my own daughter and protecting her, but also for Virginia. And my attorney, Brad Edwards, who was, you know, such an incredible man and such an incredible attorney, and part of the reason that this case was able to be prosecuted, both for Epstein and for Maxwell. I reached out to Brad and I said, I have information that I think can be helpful, and I would like to help this woman. And I loved her in that trauma bonding way, where you feel this natural draw to somebody because you've experienced things that are so similar that nobody else could understand. And, you know, I gave information that I had, and I think I was put on a witness list for her case. And I got a phone call not too long after that in the middle of the night. And it was a man, and I was asleep. I woke up and I answered the phone. And he said, you have a beautiful daughter. And he gave her name and her date of birth. And he said, you should stay out of all this stuff. And that was enough for me, you know? So I called Brad and I said, I'm so sorry, I can't be involved in this. This is what's happened. And he said, of course, you know, I'm so sorry. And then I followed it, sort of, you know, I looked online and followed things. And then the next sort of big event that happened was when Epstein died. And when he died, I was in shock. It was almost like, you know, people say, I remember where I was when Kennedy died. I remember where I was when Princess Diana died. And I remember where I was when Epstein died, when I found out that he was dead. And many of the other survivors have talked about anger that he wouldn't be held accountable in his life. I was relieved. I was so relieved. Because I knew he couldn't hurt anyone. And I knew that I would never have come forward publicly if he had still been alive, ever. I was too scared. It had been made clear to me on many occasions that, on one occasion in Palm Beach, Jeffrey turned to me in front of this other man and said, "You see, Anouska, if you know the right people and you have enough money, you can do anything you want and there are no consequences." And I believed that totally. And I believed that they would kill me. There was a dismissal hearing because you can't charge somebody who's dead. So Judge Berman was the presiding judge in New York, and he invited any claimed or alleged survivors to come and speak. And that was an unprecedented event in American legal history. I think there were about 23 of us, and I went through a tunnel to go into the courtroom. It was like being in a movie that you don't want to be in, because it was so all very cloak and dagger, and mainly because I didn't want to be sort of in the forefront. I wasn't looking for press attention. I wasn't even sure. Brad said, "Do you want to speak in your own name, or do you want to be a Jane Doe?" And I said, "I don't know, because I don't know what the implications are." And he's like, "Well, you have to decide now." So I was like, okay. And I prepared something. And so we stood, Virginia, and many of the others, Annie Farmer, many of the other survivors, we stood shoulder to shoulder in front of Judge Berman. We stood here. Epstein's attorney sat in front. Judge Berman sat. And then there was a wall of press. So I decided to say my name. And what I said ended up being the New York Times quote of the day that day. And it was a longer quote, but it was along the lines of, "I'm every girl that this happened to, and every one of them is me." And I felt that, and I still feel it. Which is actually why, when I heard Carolyn Andriano had died, when I heard that Virginia had died, there's this collective grief. Because it could easily have been me or any of the other women. I had people from this peer group in England, people who had known Ghislaine, people who I thought were my friends, and they messaged me and they said, "Oh, ha, you're famous. Are you pleased?" And no, I'm not pleased. I'm not pleased at all. I'm devastated and humiliated and embarrassed and deeply sad and frightened. And I want to hide. And I want to take it back and put it back in and go back to never telling anyone. And I was followed. I was chased in my car whilst trying to take my young daughter to school. I had drones arrive outside my window early in the morning. And I moved not too long after that because the harassment was so intense and uncomfortable and terrifying. Then one morning, I got a phone call about 6 o'clock in the morning from Brad, and he said, Ghislaine's been arrested and you're named in the indictment. And I didn't understand what it meant to be in the indictment. And I discovered that other people don't understand what that is either. Lots of people seem to think that this was a choice that I had, that this was like my case against her. This was not my case against her. This was the government's case against her. I had been discussing with my family and with people close to me that I just didn't think I could do it. The dissociation was so bad that I was wandering off and waking up out of dissociation, not really understanding how I had gotten to wherever I was. And I was losing weight and really feeling dark feelings and thinking dark thoughts, and trying to parent my daughter within this and work. So I got this statement from a woman who was the sister of a victim of Epstein and Maxwell. And she had died. She had a child, and she didn't make it. So I said, I have to do it. I have to do it. And the trial was brutal. The prosecution would show me pictures of him and pictures of Ghislaine, and I would physically jump and I still physically jump when I see a picture of him. So they had to agree to not show me pictures of him when I was on the stand, so that I wouldn't influence the jury with my reaction. And I thought that when the trial was over, that was it. I thought I did my part and I got to the end of it, and because there was an end in sight, that's how I knew I could do it. And that's how I knew that I would do this and then it would be over and then I could go back to my life. And that has not been the case. In fact, there's been more engagement now over the past year than ever before. There's been more attention on me. And since I had already come forward publicly, and particularly since both Carolyn and Virginia's death, I'm all in.
And as a survivor, how do you feel about the handling of the Epstein files and their release by the US administration?
The way that the Epstein files have been released is not surprising from this administration. And I wanted to give them an opportunity. You know, I wanted to give them grace in my own mind to do this the right way. But they couldn't have done it any more the wrong way. And, you know, I'm deeply grateful to Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna, who, with the help of my attorney, Brad Edwards, Brittany Henderson, and a few other people, put this bill together and put their careers on the line and their personal lives on the line to help us. Those are real men. Those are real men. But the way this has been handled by the current Department of Justice is beyond irresponsible. It appears to be deliberate. And I was hopeful that although information has been released about survivors that can't be put back, that's now out there in the world, that's very harmful and dangerous to many of us, I was hoping that something would come from this, that unwilling sacrifice would be made meaningful by the accountability that would come from it. That has not been the case. people are not being arrested or even questioned. There are people who I know have been named to the Department of Justice and no action has been taken. So I feel fragile some of the time. But I have never been more sure of my commitment to holding the people accountable who need to be held accountable. I'm almost 50 years old, and I know how to be afraid and to do the right thing anyway. I will not be quiet. I will not be silenced. I will not be intimidated. And I am saying that for my daughter, for other people's daughters, for Carolyn, for Virginia, for all the others who didn't make it that we don't hear about. And for myself.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
She, like, as without any warning, she just took the razor and she started cutting my genitals. It's a different kind of pain. Like, you go into shock, and my body just became absolutely numb.